Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopoulos Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the launch of our new report, The Human Rights, Risks, and Opportunities in Blockchain. I'm Marty Flax. I'm the Director of the Human Rights Initiative here at CSIS. I'm delighted to be co-hosting this event with Jim Lewis in our Strategic Technologies program, who you'll hear from later today. First popularized in 2008 as the basis for the cryptocurrency Bitcoin, blockchain has grown over the past decade and a half to become one of the most discussed but least understood innovations of the modern digital economy. The promise of blockchain to create systems of information sharing and storage that are secure, transparent, and decentralized has sparked widespread excitement among technologists and policymakers, particularly among the human rights and international development communities around the world who nurture hope that blockchain can help bypass corrupt or ineffective institutions to provide badly needed services that reinforce human rights norms more transparently and efficiently. However, as this report finds, blockchain alone cannot provide solutions to these human rights challenges, and in fact, it may introduce new ones. Blockchain systems are never deployed in isolation, but are embedded in existing technical and political systems that create challenges that blockchain can't address alone. In addition, there are very real technical and governance challenges that can complicate blockchain implementation and raises the specter of new human rights risks. So is blockchain, in the words of one commentator, a hammer in search of a nail? Or are there places in the human rights and development space where the benefits of blockchain clearly outweigh the drawbacks, especially the human rights risks? So we'll talk today about what those human rights risks are, how they apply to 4 different applications of blockchain, and how governments and companies that consider using blockchain in their work should identify, evaluate, and respond to the human rights risks that emerge from the use of blockchain. Helping us unpack these questions is the author of our report, William Crumpler, our CSIS researcher and consultant, who's going to give us an overview of his findings. We will then turn to an outstanding panel of experts who have used or considered using blockchain in their work in a variety of sectors, or who have deep expertise on how to evaluate human rights risks in emerging technologies like this one. If members of the audience would like to ask questions of our panelists during our discussion, you can do so using the Q&A button on the event page on our CSIS website. And with that, I will turn things over to William to give us an overview of his report.
Great. Thank you, Marty. Hello, everyone. So thank you all so much for joining us today. We're very happy to be able to host this discussion and be able to mark the release of our new report. So blockchain, of course, is most famously the technology that underlies Bitcoin. But in recent years, the technology for many purposes beyond just cryptocurrency. At the most basic level, blockchain is simply a distributed database that allows a group of users to cooperatively maintain a record of transactions. So in contrast to a centralized database, on a blockchain, every user has a full copy of all the records that have taken place, and they have visibility into the new transactions that are happening in real time. So this means that blockchain systems tend to be more transparent than their centralized alternatives. And because the power to make changes to records on a blockchain network is distributed among a group of users, it's harder for any single actor to tamper with any given record for their own gain. And of course, because of these advantages, blockchain has been proposed as machine challenges. Despite the impression that might be given off by some of its proponents, blockchain is not a magic wand that you can wave at a problem to make it go away. Blockchain is a tool. It has its uses, but as Marty mentioned, it's ultimately embedded in larger technical and political systems that create challenges that blockchain alone cannot always solve. So in order to better understand the potential and limitations of this technology, we investigated 4 use cases that we thought carried important human rights implications: supply chain traceability, digital identity, voting, and land rights management. In our report, you can read more about how blockchain has been proposed for each of these use cases and benefits and risks that we think may result from each. But today I want to highlight a few cross-cutting themes over the course of the project. Sorry, I seem to be having some connection issues. I'll do my best. The first is the problem of data integrity. So blockchain helps protect data from being tampered with once it's been recorded, but it does nothing to ensure that data is correct when it's first uploaded to the network. This is an issue in areas where key risks to human rights involve the challenge of collecting accurate data in the first place, rather than protecting that data from manipulation after the fact. An example of this is land rights management. So to back up a bit, blockchain has been proposed as a better way to record land records because of the way it can help prevent those records from being tampered with by corrupt authorities. Now, this is an important problem, and it's possible that blockchain may help to address it, but we found that oftentimes a larger problem is how to ensure that those land records are correctly recorded in the first place. In areas where land rights may only have ever been recorded or the first step of many land reforms is applies those rights by defining which properties belong to which people and logging that in the official record. This can be a challenging process, though, if there are disputes over who owns what or where borders lie, or if groups' use of land doesn't easily conform to the individual ownership. Land rights are formalized incorrectly during this process, either due to mistakes or as a result of corruption, then logging the results on the blockchain won't help. In fact, it would only legitimize an unjust distribution of rights, making those issues harder to rectify. This problem is also present in the supply chain traceability projects, where blockchain has been proposed as a way to track products as they move between companies in order to help businesses map out their supply chains and conduct due diligence to identify forced labor. For these traceability projects to be useful, though, they have to be able to provide downstream companies with reliable information about the labor conditions of the businesses they're linked to. If there are no reliable institutions or processes for verifying claims of labor conditions, these traceability projects will do little to empower corporations and regulators to address the violation of workers' rights. So that's the first theme. The second major theme is the need for strong governance and legal protections. Blockchain is often pitched as a way to eliminate the need to rely on government authorities or other powerful groups. But the reality is that blockchain can almost never replace these institutions or the need for strong legal protections and enforcement. An example of this is the case of digital identity. So blockchain has been proposed as a way to enable a new type of identity management system, often termed self-sovereign identity, which would let individuals manage their own credentials and identity information instead of being forced to turn their data over to large centralized data processors like they do today. But even if these systems make it possible for individuals to manage their identity without having to turn over their personal information, without strong legal requirements, there would be nothing stopping an organization from simply refusing to honor that user's credentials and continuing to collect and use personal information in ways that could endanger their privacy. What's more, if basic privacy protections don't exist to prevent risky practices like directly recording sensitive information onto a public blockchain, users could be exposed to serious privacy risks. Land management proposals provide another example of this problem. Some proponents of blockchain land rights systems claim that the technology could help protect the rights of women to keep and own land by letting them more securely record their property claims. But if a country's legal system doesn't recognize women's right to own property, or doesn't reliably enforce those rights, then the benefits of blockchain here are severely limited. Another important question to consider are the barriers to adoption and use. Even if a blockchain tool is available, there may be a variety of obstacles that would limit its adoption or make it difficult to use. For example, blockchain identity systems proposed for use in humanitarian settings like refugee camps often have to confront the obstacle that many of those individuals lack the devices, internet connectivity, and digital literacy to participate in them. In some cases, blockchain identity projects have had to be canceled due to the fact that these challenges were simply not addressable. In other cases, the solution has been for individuals to entrust their identity information to third-party custodians who would store their data and ensure they had access to it when they needed it. But the concept of custodianship reintroduces many of the same questions about privacy and control over data that had motivated interest in blockchain in the first place. Another barrier to use may be restrictions on who can participate in the network. One of blockchain's primary advantages is the transparency that comes from letting different actors see what's happening on the network. But if relevant stakeholders aren't included due to commercial or political concerns, this benefit disappears. So an example is the case of Russia's blockchain voting platform, which did not allow election monitors to participate, making it extremely difficult for any outside parties to determine whether any fraud had occurred. Similarly, supply chain traceability projects that include businesses, but maybe not regulators, NGOs, or other stakeholders, would have an extremely difficult time collecting reliable information about labor conditions or empowering institutions to act on any findings that may result. And then finally, we found that blockchain does not remove the need to consider the security of the systems being deployed. Blockchain is often promoted as a solution to security risks due to the way that it prevents data tampering. But in fact, blockchain systems are still often highly vulnerable due to the fact that those systems are built on top of other devices and software that are themselves insecure. An example of these risks is the case of voting, where blockchain has been proposed as a way to record the encrypted ballots submitted through online voting platforms. However, while proponents say that this would reduce the risk of ballot tampering, security researchers have found that even when online voting systems incorporate blockchain, those platforms can still be highly vulnerable to exploitation. In 2019, for example, one researcher was able to break the encryption used by Russia's blockchain voting pilot in just 20 minutes. Security concerns are also important to consider for blockchain digital identity projects, where an attack on the device that an individual uses to store their credentials could lead to the exposure of highly sensitive information. For digital identity projects that rely on custodians to safeguard their users' data, security risks are fundamentally no different than what exists today with the collection of data by centralized data controllers, and that situation isn't very good. So there's much more about all of these topics in our report, which I urge all of you to take a look at. But at the end of the day, our conclusion, as I mentioned at the beginning, is that blockchain is just a tool. It has advantages, and it may be able to play a role in addressing some important human rights risks. But organizations need to carefully consider the systems that blockchain will be embedded in order to understand what limitations the technology may have and what risks it may create. In particular, given that blockchain can't solve many fundamental challenges, like the problem of verifying the accuracy of records and land rights and supply chain traceability systems, we want to emphasize that enthusiasm about blockchain shouldn't distract from work and investment aimed at addressing some of those more fundamental obstacles to progress. Thank you all so much again for joining us today, and I'll turn it back over to Marty to begin our panel.
Thanks so much, William. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot to unpack, and so I'm really looking forward to our experts helping us to really dig into these issues and understand them better. And we're, in the meantime, going to work on your connection so we can all hear you as clearly as possible. I always find it ironic when we do a panel on technology and we encounter technological difficulties. It just shows that no one is immune. But let me turn to our panel. What I'm going to do is introduce our four panelists and then pose some questions, just building on some of the themes that William posed for us. And just to reiterate for our audience, if you'd like to ask a question of the panel, please do so using the Q&A button on our website on the event page for this session. But first, let me introduce our four outstanding panelists. Miriam Turashvili is head of the Project Management and Sales Division at the country of Georgia's National Agency of Public Registry. She's been at that agency since 2010, but since 2017, she has led and supervised their project to develop a blockchain land registry platform, a really innovative and important project that I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about over the course of this discussion. Julio Coppi is the Global Digital Specialist for Programs at the Norwegian Refugee Council, as well as a Humanitarian Innovation Fellow at the Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs at Fordham University. He's worked with humanitarian and human rights organizations for over 10 years, covering both field and headquarter positions. And so he's got a great perspective on some of the challenges and opportunities for implementing blockchain in the real world. Dr. Trent Larson is the Senior Manager of Development for Medici Land Governance, where he worked on the first systems for land titling and deeds with a blockchain component, continues to advance state-of-the-art software and cryptography. And so Trent will be our go-to technical expert on some of these important questions on how blockchain works that William posed. And finally, Dr. Isabel Ebert is an advisor to the BTEC project for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, which provides authoritative guidance on implementing the UN guiding principles on business and human rights in the technology sector. She's also a senior research fellow at the Institute for Business Ethics at the University of St. Gallen, and previously served as the EU representative of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, which is a shout out to my old organization. So it's a pleasure to have all four of you with us today, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. And I want to pick up on some of these cross-cutting takeaways that William posed across some of these blockchain use cases. As I pose questions to each of you, feel free to also start with a little bit of background on how you have worked in this space and how that work informs your views on the topics we're discussing today. But I want to start with Trent and Isabel because I want to start with the broader context that blockchain is operating under. As William pointed out, blockchain is deployed in the context of existing governance and political and technical systems. We have blockchain being deployed in places with fundamental governance gaps, perhaps intentionally so. And we have this problem of the risk of underlying inequalities that blockchains might end up reinforcing. So Trent, I'll start with you. This is obviously a really big challenge in the area of land rights, as William pointed out, where blockchain doesn't itself ensure that information about land ownership or boundaries is correct, or that those rights have been equitably distributed in the first place. So how do you and your organization think through this problem when you're engaging with governments on these issues, and what kind of processes and institutions do you think need to be in place to help address those risks?
Okay, yes, thank you. And thanks for this conversation. I will address that specific question about inequality. But first, from our perspective, repeating some of the themes so far, I love technology. I'm so glad to be at Medici Land Governance, where we try and apply, human-oriented systems to these areas. Now, the opportunities are fantastic because this is encouraging even more open systems. The transparency and the auditability that's given by blockchain really, gives some reliability and confidence, when a government takes an action. And it's building open standards and open data and open source so that there's more power to the people to iterate with these systems. Another great part I want to emphasize about blockchains is their sustainability. Not just as a distributed system, but there's often incentives for running the system. So when it's important data, then people can get rewards for maintaining this, and this can keep it around and increase that confidence that the data will be around for a while. So you're right about the risks, especially when it comes to building these systems. We can put, corrupt data, inequitable data on the chain. And in addition to that, there's the access problem. With blockchains, we like to give people the ability to have power in their hands to make transactions and offer information, but there's people who, the devices are costly, and even the constant network connection is costly. And so we don't want to exacerbate a digital divide there. And when it comes to literacy, it's really easy to mistakenly expose your own private data. And if you put that on a blockchain, then, not understanding the ramifications, that's a real problem. It's even worse when somebody has assets that are stolen or lost because they don't understand the security there. So custody is important. Another couple of risks are in the deployment. If we only focus on the technology, then we don't allow for people who don't have the technology to get equitable relief. And so we have to be careful to allow people to come in and record even if they're not having the devices in their hands. And finally, these systems are sometimes demonized, and it would be really sad to have any, criminalization or even discouragement of using these cryptocurrencies and alternate governance, because companies want to innovate and we can come up with better ways to govern our institutions, and hopefully everyone will be allowed to do that. So a couple of suggestions to end with. Use OIP. It's an open index protocol used on a blockchain. It allows people to see a history, but also see the last good record so that it can correct previous records. Second, roll out these systems incrementally. Do it for a department or a small jurisdiction to learn lessons. Even when it's fully rolled out, allow for a parallel track for someone who doesn't have the technology to interact directly. And finally, record minimal information. In land, we often record land use types because that's an interesting public data that is good, but don't record personal information. If you do, hash it, hide it so that it can be used later by the individual, but it is not one of those things that they can release and never take back. So going to the equitable side of your question, we have to take a lot of time to discuss with our counterparties in government as we roll out and design these systems, because we often see what we think is a good solution, but if they don't understand the ramifications, then it could be even used incorrectly. So we spend a lot of time discussing with the managers as well as the technicians. Here's how it's used. We need to start with small pilots, work incrementally, and test and test and test. Our focus is on roles of notaries and recorders, and so we're recording documents, and those could be superseded by other documents. So we make sure that we can always correct something that's in the past, which OIP, as I mentioned, allows for. So that's how we help with those situations.
Thanks, Chad. That's really interesting, and I think there's a really important point in there about the need for understanding of how these systems work by the people that are adopting the systems and by the people that are using the systems. That kind of analysis that has to go into the deployment. And so I want to bring Isabel into this conversation to talk about, you're obviously an expert on kind of how both governments and companies should analyze the human rights risks in these kinds of technologies. And so I wonder if you can walk us through how a government or even a company that's asked to deploy blockchain technology in one of these use cases, like in land rights management or voting, should think through the human rights risks. What's the appropriate way to go about that analysis? And what are some of the risks that, if they haven't already been covered, you would point to that they particularly should be focused on?
Thank you, Marty, and thank you also for the invitation to this discussion. I think it's a very timely and important one. So just to set the focus, I'm an advisor to the UN Human Rights BTEC project, which is a project that works on the implementation and advancing the uptake by tech companies on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which are in essence a soft law framework that have been adopted by the Human Rights Council 10 years ago. But they build on, of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and our belief is that this sort of common understanding is beneficial as opposed to following sort of an AI ethics approach, as we have this common basis of understanding. And in that regard, it's also one of the fundamental beliefs of the project that we don't want to demonize any type of digital technology, but that it's rather about sort of governing and managing all the adverse impacts that might come along with the use of certain technologies. So I was really happy to hear from Trent also about the necessity to roll out certain use cases incrementally to make sure we follow principles of data minimalism. So I think from the human rights risk perspective, specifically for blockchain, it's really that inception phase that carries the most salient risk that will then sort of cascade along the further processes. So it's really that moment of data recording and the contextual conditions that are crucial to take a closer look at. Obviously, following the sort of standard business and human rights dialectic, it would be important to ensure that the companies involved in the blockchain use case have a human rights policy commitment, and that they sort of identify, mitigating, and addressing the human rights risk that they associate with the use of the technology. And as I said, in particular for the inception phase, that means carrying out a thorough assessment of the potential human rights impacts, which might lead to the finding that the use of blockchain for that specific scenario is not ideal, and that there need to be some changes to the concept. It might also lead to the understanding that maybe it cannot be used at all. But at least it provides all involved stakeholders with a better sort of overview of what needs to be anticipated, what might go wrong. At the same time, of course, with all sort of pilot testing and so forth ex ante, there might still be adverse impacts that might only be felt once the technology is in use. And so what we are calling for is really a life cycle approach and a continuous assessment of the risks. So even if then the technology is being used, you need to continuously monitor whether something's going wrong. I think one key feature that also comes out of the report that I, of course, want to congratulate you on is the necessity to involve stakeholders. Not all setups for blockchain allow that really those stakeholders can participate in the design that would actually need to be considered and that need to be involved in the discussion and the rollout. So again, I sometimes, we also talk to people who have never heard of blockchain before. That does exist as well. And I sometimes use the analogy, which has its limitations, but the analogy with the art market, where before, tracing a certain artwork, you want to make sure where it's coming from is sort of, it has been purchased under decent conditions. So maybe that analogy might help to ensure that really the people are at the table that need to be heard. And I think one point that the report also makes that I find very helpful is sort of working with a multidisciplinary advisory board, that you look into the technical expertise as well as the human rights experts, and you combine that. I think in particular for digital technologies, that's really the sort of setup you need. Our experience has shown that there are massive needs for translating certain key concepts from human rights towards the technologist side, but also the other way around. Yeah, so that's why I find this discussion very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Isabel. That's great framing for us, and particularly honing in on that inception phase as a place where that kind of analysis, stakeholder engagement, multidisciplinary approach is particularly helpful, I think is a really important lesson in all of this. So I want to bring in Miriam and Julio into the conversation and stay for a moment on this issue of governance, because that's really what we're talking about, is governance of these systems. So Miriam, Georgia, you have adopted the system in Georgia, and I wondered if you can kind of walk us through how you integrated it into Georgia's existing legal and regulatory systems. Which of those systems kind of helped deploy the blockchain effectively or tackle any of the risks that that William or others have pointed to today, and if you've seen any obstacles created by the use of blockchain, such as the ones that have been highlighted, whether that's user access, whether that's user understanding of the system. Just kind of talk us through how that's worked for you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy that I can contribute in this research and be here with you. So first, before starting about the project itself, to make it clear why it was necessary here in Georgia, maybe it's better to give you the country overview, let's say. So Georgia is a post-Soviet country, and the Soviet Union, we all know that there was no private property there. So after collapsing Soviet Union, we had no idea who owned what, where, and so on. We didn't know the locations, we didn't know who were the owners, and so on. So NAPR, the National Agency of Public Registry, is the legal entity under the Ministry of Justice. And so it was very important at that time that the organization where the centralized, systematic information would have been gathered together. So we knew that we started collecting the information about the ownership. I want to answer to many things what was already said here. So the project, the blockchain project, we started in 2017, and we did not have any use case to use as an experience. We were called as pioneers in this field because Georgia was the first country which used blockchain technology in public services, and yes, we're using it in the for the land registration purposes. So the many countries, when they start exploring the blockchain technology, it's because they are trying to eliminate the corruption, but it was not the case for Georgia, because we can all see the corruption perception index, and Georgia has very high positions there. We have the lowest corruption level in the region. So that was not the case. So what we wanted to get was the higher level of security, higher level of protection. We believe that property ownership right is one of the fundamental human rights, and that's what we try to protect. So the information here in Georgia about the property ownership is public, and it's available on our website. Of course, this is the guarantee of protection, because everyone sees on our website who owns what, but we wanted to get higher level of protection, because blockchain also protects us from the physical destruction, and the information is all kept on our central servers, and that's what blockchain is an extra, like, additional layer of security over our servers. We use public blockchain, we use Bitcoin blockchain, and I just wanted to comment about the previous, like, GDPR requirements and the information, personal sensitive information. These are hashed. So we store hashed information, well, information hashed version, let's say, in the Bitcoin blockchain, and people can simply check the hash code on our website and in Bitcoin blockchain, and the identical hashes confirm the authenticity of the title. The title itself contains the information about the owner, about the property itself, about the area, about public law restrictions, and so on, everything what is necessary and what people need to know. And there is the assumption of authenticity and completeness of our document, and all the other governmental organizations are using our documents. What else can I say in this term? So challenges, you asked me about the challenges. Of course, it was not easy to implement this project. First of all, the biggest challenge what we had was the law. The legislation cannot always follow the fast development of the new technologies, but we adopted the law on electronic document and digital signature, which gave us broad possibilities. And we are still working on the special regulations related to blockchain technology, but these are not regulations for regulating, but for enabling the new projects. We are planning to implement the smart contracts in this process, and there are many international and donor organizations also included in this process. Another biggest challenge what we had was the attitude. I also believe that we should not create problems in order to solve these problems using blockchain, and the government was asking, why do we need it? Everything is okay, we have everything protected, why is it necessary? So we needed to convince the government as well. And well, what helped us is that we have not spent anything for this project. We have not spent citizens' money on this project, because government cannot fail when they are experimenting. It does not work like that. Okay, we tried, it did not work, now we will start something else. No, because it's people's paid taxes, right? But in this case, Bitfury Group funded all the project, so we did not have to spend. And also we know that it's an additional layer. We still keep the information on our servers. We have not changed the existing registration process. So if something happens, which I believe will not, everything, we can start from the initial point where we implemented this one. And also we had to explain to everyone that we were not earning bitcoins with this project, and we had nothing to do with the cryptocurrencies, and it was just the platform that enabled us to protect our data. And people, I've talked to many people, and I have to change my explanation of blockchain according to the audience I'm talking to. I start I don't know, to kids, to elderly, to people who does not know anything about the technology. And also, I always say that because I'm a woman, I'm allowed to say this, to drive my car, I don't need to know what's happening inside. So you don't need to know how all these complex mathematical algorithms are calculated in order to benefit from this system, in order to know that your ownership right is protected and no one, including the government, is able to change anything in these records. So that's what people need to know, and well, they are happy. How can I say that? Is that we know that the trust to the government is already increased in the country. So if we explain, sorry, please tell me if I go over the time, because I sometimes get very passionate and talk about it a lot. So
that's okay. I want to bring you back in because I'm really excited to dig into this this idea of trust, but I do want to make sure we bring in Giulio and keep going in our conversation as well. So I'm gonna move to him for a moment and just, Giulio, why don't you bring you in on the same conversation about governance, because you've also looked into and considered the deployment of blockchain systems, and you work particularly in humanitarian settings. And so I wanted to get a better sense from you of what are the challenges that you explored and identified when you thought about deploying blockchain, and how much of those are unique to the settings that you're operating in, and where do you see lessons from that experience across blockchain uses in other countries or in other use cases?
First of all, I think I have a very long perspective on the topic. I started researching distributed ledger technologies years ago when and we ended up organizing 2 World Humanitarian Summit for blockchain. Well, we call the Humanitarian Blockchain Summit. We have seen for a long time, we've seen developing projects inspired by blockchain or distributed technologies. There are some pros and cons on both, like options. The fact of having been in here for quite a long time also gives me a kind of cynical perspective on the topic, because I've seen a lot of time passing by and very few things changing in practice in terms of the attitude in the sector. But at the same time, I also see positive examples that are surviving, and the Georgia is one of the most interesting one. Georgia was, by the way, one of the first examples that were presented in the first humanitarian blockchain summit that I organized a long time ago, and the country sent someone to actually speak about it, and was discussed. It's a pretty interesting use case. But to frame what Dr. Ebert was saying before, in terms of the human rights lens, what I bring in is the humanitarian lens. And this is also why I usually prefer to talk about distributed ledger technologies and not blockchain, because in the humanitarian field, immutability is not a nice word. You don't want anything to be immutable. You don't want people to be traced, tracked, or identified based on data that they put in the system by trusting someone, because very likely in the very moment you're engaging with them, that trust is gone. There are weapons involved, or it's a situation of violence, it's a situation of natural disaster, it's a situation where possibly official systems are broken or unreliable or untrustworthy. So we start from a very low threshold in terms of where trust should stand. And the idea of distributed ledger technologies allows me to frame in a more realistic way what our expectations are for this technology. We want a technology that can be used in a hostile environment. And a hostile environment doesn't mean that I don't trust my government. It means I don't trust anyone around me. But it also means that possibly hashing is not enough, or even salting is not enough. As it was mentioned before, sometimes certain information should not be on the blockchain in the first place. And this is our perception. Our perception is that personal identifiable information do not belong on a blockchain, and often do not belong on a distributed ledger technology altogether. Especially if the system is backing up another system that is more traditional and that can maybe be more effectively secured, or that is least, let's say, that is a little bit less visible on a public level. That can allow a higher level of confidentiality. And this also leads me to something that Dr. Ebert mentioned before, which is the business and human rights framework. to adopt the language. I worked on that in the past. We don't focus on materiality. We focus on saliency. We focus on the impact on people. So the lens on privacy, for example, that is very often brought forward, the data protection perspective, the privacy perspective, it's a sort of a fig leaf for us. It hides the fact that the harm on people is still present, even though privacy is respected. So again, our bar is pretty high in terms of what kind of safety and security measures you should put in place and you should be validating before you actually get to the point of being able to deploy a DLT or a distributed ledger technology system. I know that this is not the case for everyone in the world. There are some cases where this trust can be built and can be respected. But this is a contribution to those who brag about being able to help the most vulnerable people through Black Law blockchain, or that their system is designed around vulnerable people. From my personal experience, very few systems are actually built around the needs of the most vulnerable people, unfortunately. And one of the proof is that very few of the humanitarian inspired projects are actually open sourced. Most of them are proprietary or under lock. It's impossible to scrutinize them. It's impossible to open them up, to look under the hood. It's impossible to check what kind of governance system is behind, who has access to what, who can change the rules of the platform, who has a say on the platform, who owns the stakes of the platform, how is the data stored, where is it stored, how many nodes, all these kind of things. What is the governance of each node? All these kind of technical things are almost impossible to decipher. And this is a broken promise in a way of distributed ledger technologies for humanitarian action. Everybody talks about it, but everybody keeps it under blanket. And that's definitely not something that we hope to see in the future. This said, we are supporting and engaging with other humanitarian partners that are trying to explore not the fancy part of blockchain, but rather the decentralized approach to technology. We have a project ongoing with several other Norway-based NGOs that is led by the International Federation of Red Cross and the Kenya Red Cross on a dignified identity to access humanitarian services. And the point is not that we want to design a platform that helps us, but it's designing a platform that will help people do about their life without us in the long term. How can they take back control of their data? How can they control it? How do we reduce the amount of data we own about them? And eventually, how can we limit to custodianship the kind of interaction that we have with them? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Giulio. I'm really struck by the contrast in the last two sets of remarks between Giulio and Miriam of the importance that trust plays in the deployment or the success of blockchain. If you have an environment, as Miriam said, where you can tell your citizens, you don't have to understand how the system works, it will work, and you've got citizens that have enough faith in the government that they're willing to use a system like that, versus a context that Giulio is talking about where the assumption is a lack of trust in that system, that system simply won't work. And it's ironic to me because one of the benefits of blockchain is intended to be this decentralized, uncontrolled or uncentrally managed approach where you aren't supposed to have to rely on trust. You're supposed to be able to rely on data inputs that are checked and verifiable and transparent. And it's just striking how much it in fact does come back to how much you trust the institutions that are deploying the blockchain. So I want to come actually back to William, because there's some use cases that you talked about in the report where people were quite negative about the value of blockchain. And one of them was in voting, which is an area that is all about trust. And I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about what the concerns were around using blockchain in the context of electronic voting in particular.
Sure. Hopefully my connection will be a bit better this time. So I think the most important takeaway from a lot of our conversations around blockchain voting was, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, what blockchain helps prevent data from being tampered with. Ultimately, these systems are built on a host of other types of hardware and software that are vulnerable to exploitation in other ways. So I mentioned that the Russian blockchain pilot, the encryption was hacked within 20 minutes by a researcher. But there have been other instances of finding that you can hack a user's device in order to submit a false ballot. You can infiltrate servers that are used to receive ballots before sending them to the blockchain network. There are ways to listen in over networks in order to discern how a user voted. So ultimately, even if the data itself can't be tampered with directly, there are ways to kind of do a bit of an end run around it. And this was quite concerning to a lot of the security researchers that I talked to. But of course, the important question that kind of comes out of that is that every digital system is insecure and vulnerable in some way. So how do we determine when that kind of risk and that vulnerability is too much, or when do we think that it's something that we can mitigate? And I think there were three factors that really kind of came up time and time again with voting that really highlighted some key ways to kind of think about that problem and how to gauge the severity of risk and do that kind of risk-benefit balancing. So one was the idea of how exactly the risk profile changes when you move from an analog system to a digital system. Because with cyber attacks, you can, a single attack can have an incredibly large effect, potentially, for very low cost. It's just a different kind of attack profile compared to more analog type paper systems, which are certainly vulnerable to manipulation, but the potential scale is something that concerned a lot of the researchers that we talked about. Then there's also the question of remedy. If something did happen, it's important that there's a way to go back and understand that there was a failure and be able to take actions to somehow rectify the situation somehow. But that could be very, very challenging in the context of blockchain voting for a couple of reasons. One is that if an election is manipulated or hacked and you don't find out until afterwards, and the only remedy is running an entire other election, that's not very easy to do. And the other problem is that it may not even be obvious that anything has happened. One of the biggest problems that kept getting kind of hammered into me through this project is the risk that there could be manipulation that nobody knows about. That you could go back and audit all the systems, take a look at all the steps, but still not actually come out with the answer of, oh, something went wrong here. And so there's the risk that manipulation could occur and then no one would know and remedy would be impossible because there would never be the opportunity to take action. And then last, the thing that is talking about elections is that perception is reality. Even if an election result wasn't directly manipulated, if somebody can do enough to people think that it was manipulated, as I think America has been seeing quite a lot, if there's the perception that an election has somehow not been, the election integrity has been compromised, that gives kind of 90% to the effect of actually tampering with an election in terms of decaying trust in democratic institutions and just generally making it much, much harder to carry through with kind of the promise of democratic elections. So all of those things ended up being really prominent themes, but I would emphasize that even though there are still a lot of challenges with the idea of having a secure online election based off of submitting your ballots over the internet, there was the promise for the creative use of cryptography and distributed ledgers and blockchain for a lot of other kind of ancillary pieces of the election administration infrastructure, things like securing voter registration rolls to prevent tampering with that, or election reporting systems, ways that didn't have quite the same, that didn't touch on the ballots themselves in the ways that would create those risks, but may be able to deal with some of the other issues of disruption that we've seen happening increasingly around the world.
Excuse me. Thanks, William. So we do have some questions coming in from the audience, but I want to frame one question to all of you first. Excuse me. Before I turn to them, and that is, all of you have pointed to some human rights risks that come with blockchain, even if on balance you believe it's valuable for your work. And all of you have pointed to the important role that governments and governance play in managing those risks? And so can I ask each of you just in 1 or 2 minutes to give us one thing that you think government needs to do in order to to address human rights risks in blockchain in the areas that you work? What is one regulatory approach or governance approach that you think is absolutely critical for governments to do in order to try to address some of the risks that you all have highlighted? And I'm going to start, if Miriam is still with us, I'm going to start with her because I'd love to hear something this is probably something you've thought about in depth. So just in 1 or 2 minutes, what is the one most important thing you think government needs to do to address these risks?
Well, thank you for the question. First of all, I think that government should do everything to make people understand how we are doing it and why we are doing it, what are the benefits, what are the risks, to people to be informed when they make decisions if they want to be included in this system or their data to be used in this platform. They should know that this is the platform where the changes are not made. It's impossible. And the information, whatever we submit there, will stay there forever, that we will not be able to delete that. That's the first. The second, if we're again talking about land, for example, or the private property, what we're trying to do in case of regulations, enabling regulations, we are trying to, as a land registry, we do not have access to the sensitive data, for example. We do not have access to the information if the person has the legal competence to draw up the smart contract, for example, because this is the data we cannot see. There are only special services who has this information. So we should make sure that person who does not have the legal competence not to be involved in this kind of agreements. Another is
I'm going to send you it too, because those were excellent. I've got inform people about the system and how it works, educate them, and limit access to sensitive data by government officials. Those are fantastic. Trent, let me turn it over to you to see what you want to add to that.
Focus on the problem. So they have to understand the challenges of the people on the ground. So the more time spent planning, understanding what their needs are, maybe they don't need a blockchain. There's so many great technologies. Centralized databases help for some. Cryptography helps for some. So Google, do I need a blockchain? and really focus on the problem of the people.
Excellent. Don't use it unless you really need it, but use it where you think you really need it. Julio, over to you.
I will simply say define the rights framework for digital assets and digital information. So, for example, what rights are recognized or attributed to individuals when it comes to their digital dimension or the digital dimension of their data and person. And that also links to the remedy measures that William was referring to. So what are the rights and how to enforce them?
Great, absolutely. What is the rights-based framework you're using the system under, which takes me very well to Isabel for her input.
Thank you. I think so. The prerequisite that we have clearly defined is that there needs to be some sort of rule of law, and there's a strong differentiation between fragile state settings, weak governance structures, and sort of rights-based environment. I think that's the very essence that needs to be taken into account with regard to making any type of recommendations for government action. And it gets to the very heart also why the business and human rights framework exists, because there are certain situations where companies might opt for using blockchain without the rule of law actually being guaranteed. And I think in that regard, the key recommendation would be to make sure that if then still such technology is used, it needs to have the highest possible standard of data protection. And as also Julio said, certain types of data should not be on the blockchain at all. And then, of course, when it comes to specific use cases on sort of land ownership the prerequisite is to have land rights regimes in place. So yeah, I have to say I can't just say two factors, because for me there need to be certain prerequisites in place first. The only thing I would say from a business and human rights perspective, any type of regulation should be process oriented, as opposed to sort of defining or blacklisting certain technologies. Yeah, so that you can have the human rights based approach.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. So I want to bring in William with a question from the audience, but we're going to incorporate any concluding remarks that you want to add to this question. So we've got a question from Sandra Weiss, who's a journalist, on a subject matter you covered in the report, but we haven't talked about yet, which is, do you see any clear advantages in blockchain technology applied to traceability in supply chains compared to some of the more traditional methods of traceability? So if you can respond to that and then give us any concluding remarks, and then we're going to turn it over to Jim.
Yes. So, and I think I saw that question come in. You gave the example of some of the kind of certification and labeling regimes which exist now to that kind of represent claims that certain products have met, a standard in either environmental or in terms of fair labor before they're produced. And I would say that blockchain I wouldn't consider blockchain to be an alternative, having the ambition of being a complement to some of those systems. So ultimately, with the kind of the supply chain problem, there are two problems you have to solve. One of them is getting reliable information about the conditions of production, be they environmental, labor, and the other is getting businesses the tools to be able to better conduct due diligence, understand who they're linked to through their supply chain networks, so that they can then make use of that half of the conditions of production, make decisions whether some of those actors may be engaging in risky behavior, whether they may need to look into that, take actions like cutting them out of their supply chain. So I think that some of those traditional kind of labeling and certification regimes are trying to answer that first question of trying to have people go in, look at certain factors, and make a determination about whether or not this production meets certain standards, and then attest to that fact. I think that the problem blockchain is trying to solve is how to make those attestations and that type of information more easily accessible all throughout the supply chain so that people can more easily make decisions based off of it. So I would see them as ultimately being complementary. But of course, something we highlight in the report is that those certification labeling regimes often have a lot of gaps, particularly as it pertains to labor issues. They tend to be kind of snapshots and don't necessarily cover the kind of full range of issues that may be happening at a particular producer. So they're an important piece of information, but they're just one piece and likely not sufficient to build a fully, the kind of traceability system that you would want to really solve these problems.
Thanks, William. That's a very thoughtful approach. Jim, I want to turn it over to you for the last word. If you want to answer very briefly any of the questions we're getting about cryptocurrency, I see a few of those coming through, but more generally, just want to get your expertise, having long experience in this work. Any reactions to our experts' conclusions or from the report? Over to you.
Great, thank you. And I'll quickly answer the crypto questions. Cryptocurrency does have human rights implications. The intent of a lot of the cryptocurrencies was to move outside of government oversight and control. The problem they have is they're not seen as they're an uncertain currency, an uncertain replacement for money. The more certain replacement is central bank digital currencies. Those have immense privacy problems because every transaction will be accessible and tracked beyond what we see today. There is the question about energy use. Bitcoin mining uses tons of energy. That's what we all know about. It uses more than some small countries. But the overall, that's different from blockchain. It depends on how you apply the technology, what the use is. So the answer to that one is it depends. What I wanted to talk about quickly, though, is a few of the speakers mentioned governance. And I think there's two problems embedded in that. The first is how to govern the technology in ways that create opportunity, while protecting rights. And this is a central problem. So we had a discussion today with an EU commissioner, Vera Jourova, and she said there's a need for democracies to develop global rules for technologies. And if we don't develop them, China will, right? So you may not be as happy. I think she may not have said China. She may have said authoritarian governments, right? We have a dilemma. There's no mechanism for developing governance. We're just starting to see things like TTC. The UN has some benefits, but it also has limits given its global scope. What we'll need is rules that protect fundamental rights and allow for dissent, but that do not block change. And that turns out to be difficult. We need standards to guide how the technology is built in ways that achieve those goals. Some of that involves consulting with the privacy community, with the tech community. Again, things where we only have informal mechanisms now. So the lesson I took away from the discussion, which was really useful, is we're not going to block this technology. We're not going to stop it. People will use blockchain or distributed ledger technology, whether we like it or not. Cryptocurrency is a good example of that. The other thing I took away from that, and this is a general rule, is digital means decentralized. If you look at finance, if you look at energy production, if you look at information, the global networks have decentralized, removed layers of control. And that's part of what we're seeing here with the use of blockchain. So the challenge for us is, how do we govern these decentralized technologies? We're just at the start of building this governance structure. It's an exciting challenge, but it's not going to be easy. And we do have competition. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists and to William and Jim. Have a great day, everyone.